Okay, so hopefully you can see the title slide. For those of you watching in black and white, this one is in technicolor. And the reason, actually, could I just double check? Are you seeing that? You'll have to shout because I have no vision of Teams.
Yes, I can see.
Okay, lovely. That's great. Okay, yes. So for those of you watching in black and white, this one is in technicolor. And the reason I chose that title is because I wanted to shift some of my presentations away from the kind of historical account of photographers that were, let's say, 100 years ago or or more. So I want to kind of move into the post-war era and to start to get you engaged with a kind of linear timeline of what photography is doing. And then obviously the backbone of all of these lectures is really to expose you to a different number of photographers that you may not have been encountered normally in your research. So some of these you will know perhaps if you did A-level photography or if you've studied in different contexts. But essentially what I'm trying to do is kind of say, okay, these are important people that you need to look at. As I said at the beginning, I'm only showing one piece of work, and actually what I would normally do, and we may well kind of evolve this into something else, is where I would look at one practitioner in depth and then go away and look at all of their work. So someone like Jeff Wall would be an example where we could do that. So in this context, you're kind of getting the surface level, the snapshots, as it were, of each of the artists and the bodies of work. And it's for you to go away and kind of go, oh, actually, I quite like that. Maybe I need to go and look at what that is. So samples of practitioners, as I said, who work across different genres of photography. I'm primarily going to focus on fashion and then segue into street photography, landscape, art, and kind of journaling. Maybe not necessarily in that order, but kind of trying to link them together and link them through time. So it's very specific that I've gone for photographers working in the post-war period. As I said, emphasis here is on you kind of taking this as a start point and saying, okay, I'm kind of interested in that guy or interested in that woman or interested in that aesthetic. Maybe I'll go and look at how that works. So the end of the Second World War signaled the beginning of peace and prosperity in a post-war Europe. So this is the kind of history lesson. So the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, ended in what I guess, I mean, you could imagine a sort of state of massive devastation, economic, physical, psychological, all of, everything had to be rebuilt. I mean, people make comparisons to COVID and the Second World War, and I guess there are some parallels, but I think in some ways the physical destruction, the need to rebuild society was kind of like the priority for governments at the time. And obviously, I'm focusing here on Western governments, Western countries, and particularly, I guess, in terms of the way that the kind of creative and the cultural economy was not really understood in the same way that it is now, but there was certainly a sense in which people needed to be inspired, people needed to suddenly start to live their life again. So it's almost like lockdown, and these are the parallels, I guess, we kind of locked down for the war. That's probably disingenuous to people going through the war, but essentially you had a disruption to the social norms, and then suddenly the end of the war, you come out of that, and there's an incentive to kind of make society better. And they physically had to rebuild, Birmingham, Coventry would be an obvious city where things were literally flattened, and then we had to start again. And sometimes you had to start again rapidly, and sometimes there was kind of chance to evolve things. And that not only included the physical infrastructure, but also, as it were, culture and the way that people were choosing to do things. So there was kind of reflection on life, I guess, that would have gone on in the post-war society. So people coming back from fighting in Europe, or theatres of war in Asia, and coming back and then realizing that life was very different and very, needed to be rethought. So fashion photography began to express a kind of freer and more democratic principles of society at that point. And fashion was one of the things that was promoted as an antidote to wartime austerity. And obviously, when we talk about fashion, we are talking about clothing. We are talking about kind of lifestyle in the sense of the kinds of things that people will do. But predominantly for us, it's about how that is presented visually. And that would have been photography, and that those photographs would have been then distributed through magazines, primarily the high-end fashion magazines. So there were less of the kind of there were probably nothing, Hello magazine certainly didn't exist, but less of the kind of magazines that you see today on magazine stands where they kind of cross different niches and genres. It would have been very much about high-end fashion, and it would have all have been around the kind of fashion design and the pictures that kind of supported that. So I'm just going to look literally as a sort of timeline of the way things were shifting and the things that photographers were doing at that time. So the thing that you'll notice is perhaps the styling, and I'm going to also sort of caveat this by saying that once I'd kind of put together some of these images, what you do notice is a particular gender bias. So there's fashion is predominantly pictures of women wearing clothes. There are some pictures of men, but it's predominantly in that post-war era, it's centered around women wearing clothes. It's also what we'll see is that kind of shift around the aesthetic of it, and I think that's what's important. So people are kind of photographers are playing with the idea of what they can do either in the studio or on location. So the kinds of people that were working that time, David Bailey, Norman Parkinson, Terence Donovan, Irving Penn, Richard Avedon, these are the kinds of people that we'll look at their work. There was an importance in photography. Now, so remember, photography is kind of emerging here. We have we're sort of 50 or so years, 50 or more years into the practice, but actually it's developed technologically. Its advances have happened quite dramatically. And the one thing in the Second World War, obviously, lots of technological advances happened during wartime, and photography would have been one of them. So surveillance, more cameras, lenses, miniature photography, obviously, by miniature I mean 35mm, was becoming much more prevalent. So the types of images that you can make with the kinds of technology that you had started to shift around and change. Also film stock, so what we'll see is the advent of colour, and I'll talk a little bit about that and the way that influenced the kinds of images that we're making, but also social norms. And I think that's something a little bit more difficult for me to speak with any degree of authority on, but I do sense that there was a shifting understanding of the role of women. So women increasingly gaining more power. So during the war, obviously, majority of men went out to fight, and women took on roles in factories, certainly in the UK. And I guess when men came back, when the war was over, there was this kind of question of what women's role was in society. So up until the Second World War, they hadn't really had jobs. They hadn't had the opportunity to work in factories or to have jobs of responsibility. And suddenly that was beginning to shift. So feminism was starting to take a stronger hold because they could kind of point to a period of time. Nevertheless, you still get images like this where women are kind of placed in a role, in a kind of objectifying role, I would suggest here. And this is just me interpreting the image, so me doing that kind of semiotic analysis or a kind of informed cultural analysis where women are being dressed, as it were, literally dressed for the photograph. And seen, I think there's much more, and this is my interpretation again, I'm not constructing this lecture out of anything I've ever given before, but I think what you see in this work is much more emphasis on form and shape, much less about the personalities, and much more about the kind of the way that photography can depict something in a very ordered way. And certainly as you go through these images, if we look back, the shape and form becomes the kind of dominant presence in the way that the images work over a sort of set piece of time. So the importance of fashion is sort of starting to be, so this is 1950, so we're 5 years on. This is Vogue. More Taste Than Money is the title of the image, and I guess in the 1950s, certainly in the United Kingdom, people weren't rich. You know, they may have had their house bombed. The economy was growing, and there was lots of money being spent. But as a country, we were in massive debt. So we basically borrowed money to fund the war from the Americans, a debt which I believe we only just paid back around about I could be wrong, but it's sort of the 1990s, they actually managed to pay back that war debt. But much like COVID, we've used billions of pounds was spent building tanks and planes and munitions. And the country itself was pretty much bankrupt, and therefore what it did, one of the things that we did was, you know, built the social services, so National Health Service, and built roads, and construction became part of the driver of the economy. And as I said, the creative economy probably was not as prevalent as it is now. So you didn't have TV in quite the same way. I mean, there were TV channels, but nothing like we have now. So there wasn't content in that sense. Magazines also would have been quite limited and targeted at a particular audience. So this wasn't really, I would suggest, sort of aimed at the working class. It was mainly kind of middle and upper class audience. Classic Irving Penn image, and here what we see is this emphasis on the studio. So this is studio work, and it's all about form, and it's all about the kind of the shape and the as it were, the structure of the image, and much less about narrative. And again, I think what I'm sort of emphasizing here is less of a sense of personality and much more about something that I guess I would say objectifying women. I think there's less sexuality in these images, and that it's much more, you know, there's a lot of kind of things are being covered up there, but it's totally about the shape and the form, and very, in some sense, graphic. And I would add to that, photographic, you know, so we have very graphical images. I guess we might sort of draw something about surrealism out of this, but that maybe will come later when we look at some other work. But, you know, everything is being looked at. There's an attention to detail there in the form and structure. And I would encourage you to think about how you could kind of emulate this sort of work, perhaps as an exercise. So, you know, it's not difficult to technically achieve this, but styling it might be more of a challenge. But you can imagine you've got like a very limited color palette there. You're working with black and white. You've got black and white clothing. You've got things formed in a particular way. So I'm looking here at the scarves and the face. What's that called? A face mask. The hat and the gloves. Everything is kind of very well choreographed and organized in there. You know, even the ripples on the gloves there, the way that's organized. So here we shift to another kind of image. So this is one of the few images with a male protagonist, or a male involved in this. And we're seeing this obviously out of the studio, but actually I would suggest, given and I don't know this image particularly well, but given the kind of posturing and the choreographing of that, that scarf that she's wearing, that's got to have some wire or something to kind of keep that in place in that way. I very much doubt whether this is a natural image. I may be wrong, but I'm suggesting that if this was shot as we can see at the time in 1956, I don't think this is necessarily a high-speed camera, shooting lots and lots of frames, and this is one that comes out of it. I may be wrong, but I'm even wondering whether this is perhaps mocked up in the studio. That would be something I'd need to go and do some research on, but it certainly looks quite a staged image in terms of the photographic reproduction there. Now, what this image, William Klein, and we looked at Klein last week in the presentation, or at least there was some images of Klein in the one I'm going to redo the slides from last week. But what this image is showing, A, the introduction of colour, but B, the use of a slightly wider angle lens to introduce and foreground the city as part of the fashion genre. And in fact, this was kind of preempting street photography. I'm not saying there wasn't any street photography happening at this time, but this was the kind of combining of that street photography that photographers were starting to get quite good at. They were starting to say, actually, this is our niche. This is what we do. This is the kind of the medium specificity that we talked about of photography, which is being able to go out in the street with your 35mm Leica or whatever it was and shoot what's happening in society at the time. And what Klein was doing here for Vogue is kind of combining those sensibilities. So we have fashion, but we also have street, and the way that that's being done obviously is primarily by shooting through. But you've probably got, rather than a wide angle lens, what you've got is a long lens from further back, and there's challenges involved in that. So you've got to kind of stage this. You've got to kind of be trying to communicate with the model from a distance, which is not always easy. For anyone that's tried that, you'll know. But you can imagine in this situation, you've got New York, busy street, and you're trying to set these things up in a particular way that sort of integrates the model with the environment. So there's a shift out of the studio into kind of the social environment. So we've moved on another decade now. We've gone from the 1945, end of the Second World War, 1950s, their range of work, and then now moving into David Bailey, Vogue, 1966 Vogue cover. David Bailey was one of the kind of personality photographers in the 1960s. So I think we can probably say, the 1960s in the United Kingdom certainly was the swinging 60s, and so music, fashion, photography, creative industries was all starting to kind of come together. So it would be parties, there'd be, obviously throughout the 60s. So I think there's obviously a misconception that the early 60s, 1960, 61, 62, these things were building, and it was actually, the Beatles, 1962, and then kind of fashion as it kind of moved into 1966 would have been the heyday of that kind of swinging 60s moment. As the kind of clock ticks, 66 became slightly more late 66. You had drugs, psychedelia, hippies, and then 67, 68. So 1967 would have been Sgt. Pepper albums. So here I'm kind of obviously referencing the music culture. And then as you move towards the late 60s, drug culture and that kind of hippie culture started to emerge in the UK and around kind of Western fashion. So you kind of have this 1950s bleeds over into 1960s and the sort of austerity of the 1950s. So the 1950s was kind of like trying to be affluent, trying to be sort of fashionable. And I think the 1960s, that affluence started to sort of really dig in. And we got the, as it were, the swinging 60s and the kind of movements in that, and the visual culture supported that. So the films, theatre, music, magazines, and photography that was going on there. And as I said, David Bailey was like a super key player in that, and he, his kind of role in imaging the stars and the celebrities at that time, similar to probably Nick Knight ranking as we know them in more contemporary contexts. Terence Donovan was again another, perhaps at the time as well known, but he sort of became less well known as it went through. I don't know. David Bailey kind of had a bit of a, shall I say, sort of a reputation of being a kind of more larger than life character, and still is. So I think he was perhaps managed his brand in a different way, but you had a number of photographers working in the 60s and producing this kind of work. So much more street photography orientated, I would say, in that sense, and also giving, still looking at form, but obviously the fashions changing, the emphasis of fashion was changing. So we can see a kind of different, less fussy kind of styling to the clothing, and then I particularly like the way that the background and the clothes are kind of being used together. So you've got lots of things that maybe you're taught not to do, starting to experiment with. So the 60s were all about that kind of experimentation, and we saw that happening quite a lot. As we moved into the 70s, and you can see I'm rapidly moving through kind of decades here with no kind of, it would be lovely to kind of just do a whole lecture on the 60s and the photography of David Bailey and people like Terence Donovan. But we moved into sort of people like Bourdain here that were kind of starting to use color, and there were lots of things that we can challenge Bourdain. So his work has been challenged a lot in terms of Me Too movement and the way that he totally objectifies and sort of sexualizes women, particularly in his work. But it's still nevertheless important, where you can see what's going on in terms of this renewed interest in color. So the 60s, I'm not saying color photography wasn't used in the 60s, obviously it was, but I think there was a renewed interest in the 70s of the kind of vibrancy of color work that was going on. But there were problems with sexuality, gender, the way females were portrayed. I think there was much more. I suggest there was a little bit more empowerment in the 60s that kind of dwindled away in the 70s. So the photographers like Hillman and Newton were producing images that were far less. I would say I would be far less comfortable talking about that work now in a positive light, even though it was the kind of the dominant move of the time. And then we go into, I couldn't quite get a date on this, but it's a classic Nick Knight image, probably around the 1980s. So Nick Knight definitely was shooting in face around the late 70s, early 80s, and his work, certainly from my memory, the things that Nick Knight was doing that was really interesting was that stuff of shooting, like in clothing terms, you kind of had the fashion shoot. So if they were shooting a shirt or a suit, instead of seeing the whole thing, Nick Knight would do like these really big close-ups of the button, and everything would be out of focus except for a little bit of the button. So it was like this really cool, almost disconnecting the image from this idea of, okay, it has to be shown, it has to be displayed in a particular way. It was all a bit more edgy and a bit more kind of playing with the medium a lot more. And you'd flick through the Face magazine and it would be saying, oh, these are the latest fashions from whatever designer, but you couldn't really see what was going on. It would just be bits of stitching or bits of kind of like the neck of a jumper with slightly something kind of poking through, but you didn't get a real sense of what was going on. And I kind of really like that. And that was particularly, or for me certainly, I think that was kind of unique to that way of ID magazine, of kind of using text and tearing stuff and trying to play with the medium itself. So stuff became the fashion photography. I think it had always been important. Photography had always been an important part of fashion, but it actually started to become the photography became important as well as the fashion images. So what the photographers were doing and how they were articulating their arts practice, as it were. It was drawing on a lot of different things that had gone on. And then we have, I guess, moving out of the sort of 80s into the 90s, someone like Rankin started to emerge. And you were certainly getting the kind of back to the celebrity photographer, but also the celebrity fashion model. So the supermodels, certainly in the 80s, you had people like Kate Moss, who we see here, but Naomi Campbell, and so these people were important to be photographed, and it was important they were photographed by certain people in particular ways, and they were kind of carrying the brand. So they were the influencers of the time, and probably still, potentially are influencers in their own right. But it was, if you imagine, media was much slower, and what you saw is kind of trends evolving. Although it felt quick at the time, I think retrospectively it was much slower than we experience it now. So you didn't kind of get this constant rotation of stuff and the constant distribution of things. There wasn't obviously the internet, as I constantly say to you guys. There's these big shifts in what was happening. But events, parties, celebrities, paparazzi, all of that stuff was starting to happen at that point. So celebrity culture, I mean, certainly in 1998, I mean, that's a bit post, Lady Diana had already died at that point, but all of that kind of royal family magazine stuff, people photographing weddings, this was all starting to kind of really come out at this time. Yeah, moving into 2000. So here we've got people like David LaChapelle working in a mixture of art practice and fashion. Again, photographers working across genres and using their sensibility, using their approaches in a particular way to image fashion, but also to make images that kind of fit into that art arena. So thinking back to David Bailey's work, so David Bailey was in the 60s a fashion photographer, but you would now see his work in art exhibitions, in the photographers gallery, in the Tate, there will be retrospectives of that work. So the work gets repositioned, as it were, when it's thought back historically. And I think that's something interesting to sort of take up, where perhaps someone like David Bailey wouldn't have said he was an art photographer, wouldn't say he was producing art, he was producing covers for a magazine. So he was a jobbing photographer in some sense. But the work then gets taken up, the iconography of those images. And as I say, go and look at David Bailey's work in terms of the images he took of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, the Cray twins, Michael Caine, all of those portraits, Twiggy, the usual people that we associate with the 1960s, and they're all done in a particular way, and they've become iconic images. So then that work kind of elevates itself into an art space. And this is where I say it's people like David LaChapelle will work in fashion, but also work in a kind of arts context. And similarly, I think you can see that in Tim Walker. So if you went to his exhibition at the V&A a couple of years ago, 2019, he's starting to construct imagery that sort of straddles that artistic practice with the work of a fashion photographer, as it were, that you would see being used in magazines and used across different kind of mediums to express kind of the sensibility of those different forms. So we have, a fashion image there with Bjork, a singer, musician, and the whole construction of that image is much more in its construction. It resembles kind of artistic practice, maybe more than kind of jobbing fashion photographer in the studio, I would suggest. Mario Testino, again, someone that you might want to go and explore. This work, interestingly enough, is up on, if you go onto his website, he's kind of got like Instagram posts. And so this is a project of work that he's doing, but then he's kind of reinforcing and reposting this work through Instagram. So you kind of got this kind of mix of mediums now, and where where perhaps things were much more clearly defined in that 40s, 50s, 60s. I think as we move into the 90s, the noughties, well, the 2000s, I think people are moving and traversing across mediums and reappropriating work in a different way. So as you can see, color photography has been used there. So that's my kind of journey through the fashion images. But color photography was invented during the 1930s, but it really didn't gain full acceptance into the world of art practice until the mid 1970s. That's not to say people weren't using it, but it didn't really there weren't proper exhibitions until around the 1970s where color photography was sort of recognized and acknowledged. So most of the time, what you had was the work of black and white was seen to be the more I'm really wanting to avoid that word authentic, which I see coming up a lot of the time in dissertation. Black and white, it was taken more seriously. That's what I'm looking for. So black and white photography was seen as a more serious form of photography up until the 1970s, really, when it was there was a shift. That didn't mean people weren't using color photography. They were, in 1957 here, but I think it was much less of the form that people would use. It was very expensive. So obviously with color, what you had is two different forms. So you had the negative and then also transparency. So photographers shooting with Kodachrome and other transparency forms, which would be slide format, and then obviously negative to make prints. Sometimes you would shoot in transparency and make prints, Chrome prints from that medium. So you can see that color was kind of just something that started to be used more by amateur photographers in terms of it. That's what the everyday people would be using with their Kodak cameras for their holiday snaps, and you take them to the chemist and get those made up. But as it were, the more serious practitioners, people that are working in the art space, were less using color photography until people like Stephen Shore. So this is an example of a Stephen Shore image from 1975. And I would say this is one of the images that when I first saw this kind of work, I started to really struggle where its importance was situated. So I couldn't really understand why this meant something more than something that I might go and take go walk down to, I don't know, the Ring Road in Birmingham and take a similar shot of a petrol station, and how, and trying to understand that is quite a challenge. But I would encourage you to go and look at, there's a couple of YouTube interviews with Stephen Shore where he talks about the composition of this image, talks about how these images were made, and obviously this is a whole kind of series of work based around, this is the street photography time, the topographics, the trying to look at what society was doing. And we're way on from the Second World War. I was kind of alive in 1975, but there was a sense in which we were using, photography was being used to document culture, document society, and to try and find its expressive purpose as an art form. And I think that was something else that came into that. If you go and see this work, if you're lucky enough to see it, it is much more, it resonates much more than you're seeing on the screen. I would also say that. Joel Sternfield, again, similar kind of bracket of photographers working in a similar way, documenting American life, American culture, but presenting it in a different way from the way that we've seen photography being used before. So this is probably starting to resist the idea of the picturesque, everything needing to look great, everything needing to be organized in a way that conformed to the kinds of standards of painting. So painting feels like a long time ago when you're in 1979 and when you're a photographer. Now you're starting to, as it were, I guess, express your medium. You're trying to say, what does this medium do for me? And maybe, a good way of understanding this, if you play a musical instrument, is that difference between playing other people's songs and then now starting to write your own tunes. And of course, when you write your own music, it still sounds like other people, the influences, but you also want something of you in there. And I think a lot of the photographers in the 1970s were trying to bring something of themselves into photography. And it's well known that photography is a very difficult medium to put yourself into. Unlike maybe painting or drawing, when you can kind of the tactility, the way that you form images when you paint with a paintbrush with your own hand, it doesn't have that mechanical block that cameras have. And this, go right back to your Walter Benjamin, the mechanical age of reproduction. The camera, as it were, intervenes in your expressive nature. So the only way you can express things in some sense is by doing something with composition and observation. And that starts to be sort of part of the challenge, I think, of photography, because maybe you can do some things technically, but by the time you do it, everyone else is doing that as well. HDR. So I'm going to go and do some HDR work, and then that becomes my unique signature style, and then everyone else starts to do it. So it becomes very difficult for you to own that. So what we need then is a different photographic sensibility, and I think that starts to kind of emerge with some of this practice by choosing particular ways to photograph on particular forms, subject matter. And as you can see here, Ernst Haas in New York, what you're doing here, you've got kind of long exposures, people moving, you've got light, you've got the kind of vibrancy of the city, and this is street photography in a different way. So street photography, as I say previously, maybe more black and white, synonymous with the kind of black and white documenting stuff. But there was a lot of this work going on during the kind of 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but evolving it as we work through it. And I think people like Eggleston started to, and hopefully this is really obvious as soon as this kind of slide comes up, that we, the first thing I'm going to talk about here is color, isn't it? So color, form, and composition. So what we have is symmetry, and then we have balance, but we also have the scene that is seen. So scene, SCENE, that is seen, observed, the kind of the observed nature of what we see around us being reformulated into something that is all about color and shape and form. So something that has an artistic sensibility. And I think that's something that photography started to do and has started to do extensively. So photographers have been kind of interested in this notion of the observed scene that has something that echoes back or reconfigures our thinking of what photography is doing in a formal context. So there's maybe less about a kind of meaning behind this image, in the sense of, okay, yeah, maybe we could do some cultural analysis of this, or but how do you do semiotics of this, and start to talk about, those are bins, aren't they, and coat hangers or something hanging in that kiosk. I don't think that would be a useful tool to analyze this image with. I think we would have to analyze this image in a particular way that speaks to artistic sensibility and to shape and form, and the idea of the use of and the observations of color. And then we move into the late 2000s. Obviously, this is 9/11 and the documentation of the aftermath of the Twin Towers, being destruction of the Twin Towers. And I simply include this because I think this is that use of color. So much more synonymous now. We're used to seeing color. This is almost certainly digital as well. But what we have is a shift of work where we can start to see things shifting in terms of the way that things are presented. So this is documentary, but it's also presented in an aesthetic way that maybe moves our understanding from the aesthetics of art into the aesthetics of documentary and the kind of the trauma of some of these kinds of images. So we have this kind of juxtaposition of something where we've kind of making, I guess in the 1920s in surrealism, we made things strange. So there was this idea of making things look weird and strange with surrealism. You photograph things from odd angles. And now I think there's a thing of making it look beautiful. I mean, kind of maybe making things look aesthetically pleasing in some way. Yeah, so another movement through that kind of links from this. So we link with the idea of the street photography and the observational photography that people were doing through to this idea of the movement of the new topographic. So if you haven't looked at that, it was an exhibition that came about in the 1970s, I think, of the new topographic movement. Yeah, it was 1975, brought together work of around 10 photographers who, although they didn't kind of identify themselves as this group, they kind of were working in a particular way. And again, I encourage you, if you're interested in this form of working, to go back and look at that, because it expresses something of the photographicness of the time, that people were doing this kind of front-on observational way of looking at things. So what we had is a series of photographers. We've got Robert Adams here working in this particular Colorado Springs, but he also, there's a whole set of images that are similar to this. Henry Wessel, I think what you might struggle with is the way that they photograph things. So there's a lot of front-on imagery, and it was the kind of everyday stuff that you experienced around Americana kind of stuff that you'd see in an everyday context. So a lot of this work is, you can see it's drawing on kind of the abstract nature of photography or its subject matter, but it's an abstracted view. So the idea of the topographics was they were seeing the landscape in a way, it was a man-made landscape, and they were trying to get a kind of observational distance from it. The Beckers here are the most closely associated with it, and the Beckers did this topographic, so they would do a series of work and they go and find the same things each time, and they just kind of re-photograph it they would photograph it from a particular viewpoint, which is this flat-on, front view of a thing, and then they would just kind of do a systematic series of those same things. So here we have water towers, but they would, it would be a number of different things that they see in and around themselves that were man-made. And this is the kind of, I mean, this one is 1988, but there was a whole series of work that was done in this way, and that is synonymous with the topographic approach. And you guys are probably doing this in your own work, but not really understanding, maybe not necessarily understanding where it came from. What we have is this way of photography being much more objective. So it's not about an expression in the way of kind of artistic form, but it is that term that I like to use of the photograph or the camera becoming almost a photocopier of the world. So it's just recording what's there, and the way that I mean, another classic example of this is the 21 gasoline station. So basically, it was a series of images. Oh, sorry, a series of images of petrol stations, just photographed all the different ones to kind of make a typography, a sort of a collation of what is out in society. And we'll do, what I'll do is a particular lecture on this, because I think this work has informed, as I say, knowingly or unknowingly, our process and practices today. You know, we can see a kind of Instagram-ness to this work, that maybe, you know, obviously Instagram wasn't invented at the time, but there is something of this work that is kind of emerging. So the next kind of series of work is the kind of the visual diaries, and again, preempting or anticipating the kinds of photographs we now take with our mobile phones and cameras, photographs that we use to journal our everyday lives. So this is Larry Clark. I love this title, Accidental Gunshot Wound, 1973. So this was the way that photographers, and they were particularly photographers that are connected with documentary photography, that then became arts practice. So they produced books, they produced monographs, but they also very much their work was seen in exhibitions. And we're talking about people like Richard Billingham, Larry Clark, Nan Golding, who would photograph what was going on around them or themselves. So they were immersed in the culture, immersed in the environment that they were living in. And it will be about documenting that in a particular way, that we then had a kind of series of work that very much sits within the documentary genre of photography, but is also that kind of brutal confrontation with the underworld, with the world of drugs, with the world of sex, with the world of kind of people that weren't living a glamorous lifestyle, that were living a kind of challenging lives. And obviously, I mean, particularly Nan Golding has influenced a lot of students and a lot of work because of the way that she kind of depicts the kind of everyday nature of her existence, and that kind of that territory where we're sort of we're using the camera as just a way of kind of expressing the torment of our lives lived, as it were. So Corinne Day as well, producing, you know, images of just kind of photographing people. I think what you need to get away from here is the sense in which, so what I have seen, not necessarily at BCU, but with other students, is this kind of tendency to say, okay, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this style and I'm just going to photograph my mates who are living in this house with me, you know. And I think that's a misunderstanding of this approach. And I think this approach is a much more enriched, embedded account of lifestyle that is, and I'm not saying that student lifestyle isn't a particular lifestyle, but this isn't a way in which you can use a short circuit your practice. You know, this is about being involved in something over a long period of time and really expressing the uncertainties of that counterculture, and really understanding what it's about and expressing it in a particular way that does it differently, even though there is some kind of similarity in the approach. And I do sometimes get frustrated with students who kind of use it as a way to kind of, okay, I'm just going to photograph my mates on a Saturday afternoon, eating their lunch, and then, you know, doing a kind of Richard Billingham or whatever that is. And I think there's a sophistication to this work that perhaps is sometimes lost when you try to emulate this work in a perhaps what I would say is a kind of naive way. So if you're interested in this work, you need to really get under the skin of it and understand what is going on. It's not just someone going in and photographing mum and dad watching TV, and then, you know, that amounts to a project. Wolfgang Tillmans, again, he has done a lot of different work, but specifically, you know, gay culture and drug culture and drinking and things like that. But there's a formality to his work, as in a formal quality of his work that kind of is situated with the other work that he's doing. So you need to, you know, obviously go and see a Tillmans exhibition, look at his work in monographs to understand. You know, just seeing one image is not giving you sufficient traction on the kind of work that he's producing. So I encourage you to go away, undertake a kind of analysis of the work and try and see what's going on, try and see what's being expressed. So the final thing I'm going to look at here is something which I think is useful in terms of its reference back to art. So that's the tableau. So that is and the tableau was something that was used in painting to create or construct images and paintings of meaning. So the meaning was formulated, so painters would put together different things within the image in what they called a tableau. And the tableau contained a narrative that we could understand. And this was then adopted by photographers to create images that had what we might call theatrical, or I think more commonly placed now, we use the word cinematic qualities. And these images are essentially all staged and orchestrated. Now, many of them may look as though they're just snapshots, and here you can see why I joined this up with the kind of the Corin Days and the Nan Goldings, is because what we have is a staging of that kind of work, and this is done in a particular way, in that this is lit, this is carefully choreographed, this is everything is put into place in a particular way in order to make the image look like it's not staged, and yet everything is kind of staged for the camera. Jeff Wall, I've shown you before, and this is his Sudden Gust of Wind, and this is taken from a painting by Hokusai, I think it is, I'm terrible, Japanese painting. It's a Japanese sketch, actually, etching. And you can go and Google this and you'll see the original sketch. And then what Jeff Wall has done is he's constructed a number of images to make this one single image. So there's digital composition in here, and this is, Jeff Wall's work is the result of extensive sort of staging of work. So finding a location, lighting it, models, getting the choreography, and producing this body of work. So it's way more than just getting people out there and throwing some paper up in the air and hoping that you produce the image that you're anticipating there. Yeah, so again, we have a series here from Karen May Weems, which is the kitchen table, a series of staged images. Everything is kind of organized and presented for the camera. And then people here, we have much more of this kind of surrealist movement in photography, where the staged image is all about constructing sets that are extensively built. You can see here everything's been sprayed. We have the goldfish been moved and placed around the set. I think that, it's quite likely there's some digital manipulation in some of this work, but probably at a later stage. But this is 1981, so this is almost certainly sort of pre the kind of in-camera digital, it probably wasn't shot digitally, and there may well have been some post-production later on. But what you have is this kind of construction of sets, and I think this is, most notably, and this is my final image, Gregory Crutzen, and encourage you to go and look at the videos of his kind of behind the scenes, how he makes this work. So these aren't necessarily buildings, locations, places where people live. These are now, with Crutzen's kind of ambition, he actually builds these sort of stage sets on the kind of places where you would make films. And that was Crutzen's kind of project, was to make work that summed up cinema, he didn't want to make a movie because that was too complicated. So he made a still image that encapsulated, if you like, the spirit of a film. And it's all done through posing, lighting, and everything else. And I think this particular one, there were some issues with the crying baby. So that is a live baby, a real baby that kept crying, and they had to warm up the room so that the baby slept, and so they got the kind of image work. But definitely go and kind of, if you haven't looked up that work before, it's worth looking up the YouTube videos of these kind of behind the scenes, and you see about the meticulous attention to detail, the amount of dirt on the windows and the snow, how it's moved away from the scene. Everything is made in a way that you've got to imagine this work in the sense of an artist painting a picture, you know, and kind of like putting the detail in the picture with their paintbrush. And what you see with a photographer is that detail has to be real, has to be put in front of the camera, and that is basically what Crutzen kind of really demonstrates quite effectively in the work that he's done. Right, let me stop sharing my screen. Hopefully you saw all those slides. I'm dreading the moment when you all go, oh no, John, you know, just stayed on the title slide. Okay, that's the end of that presentation. As I say, that was more of a kind of ramble and amble through a number of photographers that hopefully some that you weren't aware of, or maybe if you were aware of those, it was some different images. If there's something there that that kind of really interests you, as I say, the start point is the library. Looking up online, obviously you can go and look up extensively their work, but trying to understand a little bit more about the critical and cultural context of that work. And then we'll try and develop a little bit more in terms of the kind of theoretical lectures going forward, what this work kind of does and how it speaks to you as scholars of photography. Any questions, any thoughts, or any sense in which you want to just kind of feedback on the kinds of things I've been doing with you, and maybe we can kind of evolve that in the semester too. No. Okay. Cool. Okay. Well, I shall leave you there. Hopefully maybe we'll see some of you this afternoon for the Christmas drinks. If not, have a great Christmas, and I will probably be back with you in January, assuming we don't get locked down or some strange thing happens in the United Kingdom with COVID regulations. Let's keep our fingers crossed, and we'll all be in the university as usual. Thanks very much for listening. Thanks again for kind of watching my slides.
Thank you. See you later.
Cheers, Luke. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.